Do you want to give a compelling speech, but you are afraid that the audience will disconnect or get bored? Let's ask Jason Thomson, a professional speaker and copywriter who has worked with leaders of key brands to have a more fascinating speech. Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Bruce, and today we have Jason Thomson. Jason, welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Oh, I'm rubbing my hands in anticipation of our conversation.
So I'm going to let you introduce yourself in 1 minute or less.
1 minute or fewer. I tell people that I am a content sledgehammer. My goal is to help people think differently around every conversation that they ever have. Now, I spend a lot of my time keynoting, developing presentations, and copywriting in areas like presentations and pitching and everyday communication. So I often get put as the quarterback lead for teams that go out and create pitches or branding, or what I do most of the time, which is presentations. I do that as a coach, as a workshop lead, as a keynote. I have a master class. I mean, there's about 1 billion different products and services that I've got with my brand, Speak Up, Get Results. But the bottom line is, it isn't about me. It's about you, fabulous audience, and how you can better connect with the world around you.
Okay, so tell us some of the reasons why and how are people misconnecting with their audiences, both in the way they deliver it and in the content.
You know, I find misconnection to be the single biggest challenge that we have in communicating today. And it's a word that I didn't think that a lot of people were using. We hear the word disconnected a lot. And it's true, audiences are disconnected more than ever before. We know that in a live presentation situation that 100% of audiences disconnect every 15 minutes. You know, the dog runs through the frame, or they run out of coffee. That's in the virtual space. And then in the live space, they're actually bringing that to the table. I see people that watch bad presentations get up and walk out of room. This happened to me this year when I was on stage as an onstage host. And I watched a presenter who I'd seen during rehearsal and knew that they were going to be in trouble. They were just before lunch and people walked out. That's disconnection. Misconnection is the opportunity to change that, because we are enabling all of this to happen. We have more tools than ever before to connect, whether that's social media, messaging platforms, good old phone calls and one-on-one conversations. And yet we are connecting worse than ever before. We are reacting instead of responding, and we're lacking things like empathy and good listening skills. And we're not helping our audiences do things like scan our messages quickly, which is important because they're bored, they're stressed, they're easily distracted. They're waiting for you to breathe so that they can talk. That's them disconnecting and you misconnecting on the other side of the ball. Your goal is to be empowered to change that. And that's the good news, is that we have the power and the ability to end misconnection. We can build the specific skills and we can build strategies that we can be more effective in how we connect with audiences. And I use that term audiences, but it's not just in the corporate space. We're misconnecting in the personal space too, with our spouses and our families and our friends and things like that.
But let's focus on keynotes, because you're a keynote. Yeah. So let's focus when you give a presentation in front of a big audience at the end of the year as a leader, or when you're presenting as an expert in front of a large audience. What is the biggest challenge and how, because in a keynote, you don't have feedback.
That's right. But you do. And that's the weird thing about feedback in a keynote situation, is you can watch and read an audience in real time to see if they are picking things up. I will choose people in an audience and I'll watch them and say, that person is not buying what I'm saying right now. I'm going to focus on them and make them believe what it is that I'm talking about. But ultimately, if you are a CEO and it's the end of the year or the beginning of next year and you're doing the kickoff presentation, the biggest mistake you can make is starting with your content. So often as a speechwriter, I get the following phrase almost 100% of the time when I'm dealing with somebody for the first time. Jason, here's what I want to say. And it's like, hang on a second. we spend too much time saying too much. Before you get to the what I want to say, you have to understand why you're on that stage in the first place. And people don't necessarily understand that. I deal with, leaders in pitch situations and presentation situations all the time. And I'll say to them, why are you even presenting? And they'll say, well, I want to tell my audience this and I want to tell my audience that. And I say, but what do you want your audience to do when they finish with the conversation that you're going to have with them on stage with the presentation? And you'll hear things like, I want them to email me. I want them to change their behavior. And I said, well, then that's the reason you're presenting. So then the second step becomes, who is your audience and what can you give them that will get them to do what you want in the first place? Then you focus on your content. You have to profile your skill set and their skill set before you get to it. And that is the biggest mistake that people do make when they present from a keynote perspective.
So give us an example of a specific client you have.
I deal with a lot of high technology organizations like IBM. I deal with banking customers like RBC and TD in Canada. I've dealt with Cirque du Soleil at C2 Montreal, where I've moderated and been on stage. These are always unique perspectives. I'll take Cirque as an example because it was a fantastic experience, which is I was dealing with a creative professional, which tends to be less conservative than most of the leaders that I talk to on a frequent basis. And so they've got all of these great creative ideas. The person I dealt with, Michel Laprise, was the director for Madonna's Super Bowl halftime show. And of course, he's got all of these really great, big, powerful, incredible ideas. He knows how to put together narrative. He knows how to make an audience laugh or make the audience cry. What he needed was structure. And structure became a really big part of the conversation that we had in the weeks leading up to the presentation. I went to Cirque's campus and got an incredible tour of the place and really learned how to button things down. He actually made me a better speechwriter because he helped me understand the value of emotion. And we've learned and we've seen that emotion is the most powerful thing that you have to generate in the first 4 seconds of a presentation. People don't spend enough time on their first minute or their last minute. He did. And because of that, literally, I watched people weeping at the end of a workshop keynote presentation. I had never seen that before, which is pretty incredible.
So what did he say? What did he say specifically that got people so emotional? And why was he so skilled at creating this emotion?
That's an outstanding perspective is what he had, which was he understood the audience. He understood that his presentation wasn't about him giving the audience something. It was about him empowering the audience and to help them unleash their own creativity, something that they may not have necessarily had walking into that room. And because he focused on the audience like it's, I'm going to be the wind beneath your wings, instead of you listen to me and all of the great things that I have to say, he was someone that they liked. You know, he had this whole idea of reciprocity, which is he's giving people things. He gave them each a red pencil. So as a gift very early on in the presentation, when you give people something, whether it's value, insight, or a pencil, they give you something back, attention. And that is something that every leader should learn, is that your audience, I call it MERV, meaningful, interesting, relevant, valuable. If you aren't hitting all 4 of those in your presentation, there's a good chance you're losing your audience. And if you're losing your audience because they're staring at your PowerPoint or you're boring or you're not giving them anything valuable, then they're not going to move. And so Michel did a really good job at understanding that.
Give us an example of how he created that emotion. Did he do a story? Did he give his personal story or somebody else's story, the struggles they went through and how they overcame them? Because, I mean, creating emotion is not that easy. You really have to go deep in yourself and your own story or someone's story to sort of create that emotion there on a trip.
The key to creating emotion is to have the audience. You can't tell an audience anything. You have to get them to unlock that for themselves. So the simplest way, and he did exactly this, is he asks a question, right? When you ask a question to the audience where the audience is forced to think about things, they begin to decode things. So there's one. Storytelling, yes, absolutely. Lots and lots of storytelling. And the key to storytelling in the space in which we work. And the mistake that I see most often with storytellers is in the corporate world, they give you a case study, right? Problem, solution, result. A story is a moment in time. So, and I'll coach people on this very frequently, which is the idea that don't just tell me the antiseptic what happened. Put me in the boardroom, put me somewhere, give me a perspective. And Michel did a really great job of that. Like, he talked about his own childhood, right? And when he helps you visualize it, when you can help an audience visualize anything, that's something that drives that sense to emotion. So get them to be a passenger with you. So asking that question, that's one great way to do it. Telling an incredible story, giving them a light bulb, aha, or insightful moment. You know, one of the things you can do in that first 4 seconds and say to yourself, what emotion am I trying to create? What's the tone I want to create for this presentation? And you can say something as simple as, I'm going to tell you the saddest story I ever heard. I've just primed you for a sad story, and I've generated the tone that will get to that emotion that I want in the first place.
So what do you suggest, for example, for leaders at the end of the year when they want to highlight the areas, the challenges they had and where they were successful? And basically, it's very financial. How would you entice them to be more personal or more emotional, giving the results of the company?
First thing is ditch what I call the chronology narrative. Here's what we did. Here's where we are. Here's where we're going. Your audience doesn't care. The audience wants to know is, where are we going? What do I need to do to continue to be successful? Certainly you can tuck in things like recognition and storytelling from that perspective. But if you start thinking about your presentation less as that, here's what we did, here's where we are, and here's where we're going, and more, I want to give you an aha, a thing that you don't have, a perspective, a theme, an approach for the year to come that is going to make you the best that you can possibly be. Suddenly I'm interested because you're giving me something I don't have. And in that, as you're saying, you know, our focus for next year is resilience. Let's talk about how we're going to develop resilience across our organization. And then you can get into things like, let me tell you the story of already what I'm seeing in resilience. So there you're tucking in the where we were and what we did, but you're doing it in a way that is more organic and interesting to the audience. You're giving them that recognition. You're telling them a story, but you're doing it in service of the forward focus. Every great presentation needs to be about something, not about everything, about something specific that I can take away and I can remember. You should be able to summarize your presentation in a single powerful headline and sentence. If you can do that, then you've got something to unpack. Look at the best presentations. Look at the TED Talks that everybody likes to talk about. The best ones have a central thesis or a point that gets unpacked. That's what you need to do as a leader. Don't just avalanche me with stuff I can't remember. Give me a perspective and empower me to be better.
So you gave a nice example of resilience, you know, how people can be more resilient in the future, or how they were resilient in the past and how that's changed. Is that the central theme is resilience, and then you put in the information you want to share? Is that, I understood that correctly?
Yeah. And to that end, what's critical is, what do audiences hunger for? They want process. Show me how to do it. I call it a liquid process, which is give me the 5 steps that will help me be successful. And then in each step, give me enough tools so I can customize that process to be the best that I possibly can. So process is a thing that audiences look for. Stories are what they look for. Examples, best practices. They also look for tools and resources. You know, what are the podcasts that I should be listening to, or the books that I should be reading? Who are the people I should talk to? But really, that's what you're in that MERV model that I've got. That's the value, is that consistently give me stuff to make me better. And then you have a reason for being on stage. Because the truth is, in a chronology narrative, you can send that out in so many different ways: video message, email, Snapchat, whatever it is, you can send that out. So if you're going to be on stage, make that time valuable, and value is what you can deliver.
So you mentioned about medium. For leaders of companies, is there any particular medium that you favor and why and in which context?
You have to understand that audiences do not absorb in a linear way, that audiences need a variety of tools. So to understand, there isn't a preferred medium in which to present. There are mediums that match effectively well. So process, infographics, right? Visualization, that's a really great thing. If you want people to be inspired, yes, presentations are an excellent way to generate a sense of inspiration. One-on-one conversations, that's a way where you can get people to give you that real-time feedback. I look almost as a campaign approach to communication. You know, as a guy who's been a creative director and a content director in events and traditional advertising, you can't look at a single one-dimensional approach. That's not the way. If you have kids and you ever tell your kids something and then they don't do the thing you tell them to, right? Hey, I need you to clean up after you make dinner. And then the seventh time that they don't do it, you're pulling your hair out. Well, what is it that will get them there? It's not just telling them something. It's also modeling it, right? Like if I clean up after myself after dinner, my kids have a better chance of doing that. You know, if it's creating a culture within the organization. So there's a lot of different triggers that you can use. Presentations, like I said, good, strong thing for inspiration and getting a key message across, and then unpacking that message over a number of different channels. I worked for many years as a content lead and a strategist for a big bank, and we did recognition. And we had more than 40 different channels that we were using to be able to carry that recognition story. There were presentations, there were posters in branches that almost served like billboards. There were stories that we would archive on the web. There were incentives that we would tie in. So we look at the individual situation and say, well, how do we solve this connection problem? How do we end that misconnection?
Wonderful. So, okay, we're not all keynoters and we're not all leaders, CEOs of big companies, but was there any specific tools and ways that coaches can help leaders besides what you've already said? What would be one approach?
I'm going to give you 4.
Okay, good.
The key thing when I look at presentations is and conversations, because I think about it in that kind of general sense of any type of conversation. So you're giving a keynote, you're having a meeting on a Monday, you're part of a panel, you got to do media Q&A, you're having a conversation with your kids or your spouse. There are a couple of things that you can do to end that idea of misconnection. The number one is learn how to speak in headlines. We live in a headline world. You know, you look at your text messages, you look at social media, you look at media clips on the news. People want everything faster. And so your best friend can be to effectively get good at delivering strong, short headlines. It helps you basically drive a map for your audience, because your audience doesn't necessarily know where you're about to go. You don't know where I'm about to go here, except I did give you a bit of a map. I said, I'm going to talk about 4 things. The first one is speaking in headlines. So that helps you get there faster. Now, good headlines, they deliver context. So they don't just tell you what, they tell you why or how. They're memorable and they're short. And here's a simple one, right? Is Q3 results is a bad headline if you're presenting or on your PowerPoint presentation. A good headline is collaboration drove record Q3 results. And so now you know if your audience disengages, that when they do re-engage, they can touch that headline and go, it's about collaboration. That's the key here. That's the context I deliver. So there's number one, is speak in headlines. Number 2 is help people scan. You almost need to think about your communication in the same way that you would think about developing an app for the iPhone. There needs to be a user interface, because people don't listen. They scan. People don't read. They scan. It's why magazine articles are so effective, because what do they have in a magazine article? Short paragraphs, lots of white space, subheadlines, photographs, pull quotes. You can do that verbally as well. You can help them get there with things like navigational cues. Here's a simple way you can help people scan. You know what? I'm going to tell you 4 things, the 4 things that you need to do to communicate effectively, right? So that I'm helping you scan, because right now I'm on number 2 of 4. I'm about halfway through. The third thing we touched on, which is tell more real stories, not just case studies. And the reason for that is that storytelling creates instant emotional connection. There's a small area in your brain called the Broca's area. That is a language processing center at the front. So when you start, barfing back the numbers that kind of flow through the brain, you're only engaging that little tiny area of the brain. But if you couch those numbers in stories so that they can be really valuable. And there was somebody I coached earlier this year. He had like 70 different numbers. I said, nobody's going to remember any of that. Let's focus on 3. Get up on stage and say, listen, there are 3 numbers I need you to understand right now. And then that became the cornerstone of his story. So that becomes really important. And then again, good storytelling is detail and visualization. If I can close my eyes and I can see it, then I can buy into it. And if I feel like I'm part of that story, like I'm almost like an extra in a movie, that's really valuable. So there's number 3. So speak in headlines, help people scan, tell more real stories. The last one is the one that I've been playing with the most of late, which is I love behavioral economics. It became a weird hobby over the course of the pandemic. And I learned that for all the words that we use, and we use a lot of words, in this answer alone, I'll probably deliver somewhere in the range of 1,000 to 1,500 words, is that there's a lot going on in the brain. And one of the key areas you can focus is associations and triggering. We use triggering as kind of a bad statement in our world right now. I was triggered, but you can make positive triggering. And really what that is it's getting people to remember stuff. So storytelling is a great association tool because what happens is people remember the story. And if you finish your story with the powerful message, they remember the message. I call this human highlighter.
So Jason, I want you to give us, for our listeners, examples of association and of triggering.
And I'm going to give you one right now in that human highlighter, which is to say, if you're talking to somebody and you say, look, if you write one thing down today, it's this, right? If you remember one thing that I say today, remember this. That single statement is so powerful. Another example is that storytelling. Tell me a story and then get that line. Another one, white space. Right? Which is in white space in writing is like those single line paragraphs surrounded by literal white space. When you talk, white space is simply just going silent like that. And then that gets people listening and saying, oh, what's going on there? And then that becomes another triggering and association approach that you can make.
Excellent. Great. So well, back to the drawing board of all these things. We have to look back at our keynote.
That's the thing is with our communication and connection is we don't think about these things. We learn these skills in life and then they freeze like the mosquito in the amber in Jurassic Park, right? Is we just build on this faulty foundation. And the more I learn, the more I'm learning, oh my goodness, we are doing a really bad job at connecting with one another.
So we're coming to the end of our podcast, and would you share one tip with our listeners today, Jason, that they must, the last thing, if they remember just one thing, what would it be?
I'm going to go back to headlining. Headlining is the number one thing in connection that you can get really, really effective at. But we covered that, so I'll give you a second one.
Good.
And here's the second one.
Yes.
Build real empathy. See, we hear this phrase empathy all the time, and we hear about it's important to be empathetic, and we talk about it from a conceptual perspective, but we don't actually understand it when someone disagrees with us. Suddenly empathy goes out the window. So if you're on social media and somebody has voted for somebody that you don't like, suddenly they're an idiot. And that is actually the moment where empathy can be the most important. If you want to convince somebody of something that they don't necessarily believe in, your job when you hear something you don't like is to say, why do you believe that? Because that's where empathy begins. And true empathy drives, it's kind of the heart of connection, because you don't necessarily have to agree with somebody, but to understand what's driving their mindset makes an enormous difference in any type of conversation that you have.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm sorry we're coming to the end of our podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris's CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.